Hey all you whiskey lovers. Today we're going to talk about a pretty big topic in the whiskey world. What is happening when you mix whiskey? And how does that affect the end whiskey that you're tasting? Are you doing it for the right reasons, or should you try and experiment with something else? Let's jump into it. So, right off the bat, I think it happens all too often. It happens to everybody at one point or another in their whiskey journey that somebody tells you or gives you a glass of whiskey and that whiskey is a little bit too strong. Maybe it has a lot of ABV, like for instance, this Valenche Collective bottle that I have here, which is just 62.5%. Now that's a lot of whiskey, or a lot of alcohol. So the first thing that somebody might tell you is put a drop of water in it, or put a few drops of water in it. Because maybe you take a smell of it, you sniff the glass, and you just get a whole bunch of ABV, you get a lot of alcohol, and you can't get through to the other aromas. So somebody may have suggested adding a drop or two of water. Now, I don't want to say that I am against or for doing this, but I want you to know what happens when you do and how does a few drops of water affect the end product or affect the end whiskey. And what should you expect? So, firstly, I don't ever add water to a whiskey which is anything less than like 45% alcohol. I think that if you are having a hard time drinking whiskey, which is 45% or more, then check out our video on how to drink high ABV whiskey, because you're probably can take advantage of some of those tips and tricks and not need to worry about adding water just to make the whiskey a little bit more palatable. But what adding water actually does to whiskey is quite interesting. For starters, I don't know if you, I can't imagine that many just whiskey consumers have a refractometer at home, but this device here, and I'll just quickly pop it out of the box and show you all, is a very quick and easy tool. You see something very similar to this in the beer world, and there's different types. So you can have something like this to figure out the sugar content in a wash, or you can have something like this to check the ABV of your spirits. Now this isn't very accurate, so you gotta take that with a grain of salt, but for this case, I think it's quite interesting. So with the refractometer, with a glass of whiskey, and by adding 3 drops, what happens is the ABV of the alcohol, of course, does go down. So we are taking a certain amount of whiskey, adding some water to it, and we're diluting the whiskey. So that means that the ABV, which at the beginning on the bottle says is 62.5%, with my refractometer, it shows me 60% plus minus. And after adding 3 drops of water, it actually takes the ABV of the whiskey down to about 55%. So just so you have an idea of how much the alcohol dropped by adding just a few drops of whiskey. Now, don't be confused. There is still that much alcohol in the glass. There's just a little bit more water. So you're still going to have the same effects on your body. Drink it slowly. Drink it to enjoy it, not to just get all messed up. Other than the ABV dropping about 5% for 3 drops of water, you're also going to get kind of a different nosing experience. You're going to get a different smell out of the whiskey. And that is because when the water gets added to the glass of whiskey, what's actually happening is that the water is mixing with the whiskey and actually breaking down some of the molecules which are in your glass of whiskey already. This actually happens when you open your bottle and pour it in the glass. Anytime you're introducing new oxygen or other molecules to your whiskey is always changing. But when you add water to it, it's very, very quick. And again, it's 5% difference, 3 drops. It doesn't sound like a lot, but you're really changing the chemical compounds in the whiskey. And that means that you get a very different nose out of that product right away. It breaks up, and alcohol in general is a preservative. It keeps things together. That's why the flavors and aroma of a whiskey last so long. Even when it's aged for so many years, it's the alcohol that's keeping it together. By adding water to it at a very theoretically proportionately high rates, you're breaking those components down, those molecules down, and now you're releasing some of them into the air. And if you have a glass like this, a Glencairn, pointing it right up at your nose, so now you might be able to better appreciate some of the different smells or aromas in that whiskey. Now, if it's burning or it's still too strong for you, go for it, add a little bit more. There's nothing, it's your taste. If you like it, that's all that matters. But we now know that when you add about 3 drops, you're dropping 5% of ABV, plus minus. You are then also, of course, adding a lot more, and this is at 62%, you're dropping 5% of ABV, plus minus. You are breaking down the molecules which are in your glass of whiskey, and in doing so, you're opening up the nose and letting a lot of the aromas which have been trapped by the alcohol out. How does this affect the taste? The truth of it is, not by a whole lot, at least not for me. And I don't know if you know this, but a lot of your taste is actually done or kind of influenced by your nose. How you smell something is usually how something tastes. And a good example of this is if you are sick and your nose is stuffy or your nose is clogged up, food doesn't taste the same. It's not as enjoyable or not as rich as it would have been if your nose was open and if you were smelling the aromas. So taste might get a small difference, but it is quite small. Why I like high proof whiskeys like this, like a 62% as an example here again, right? This is a barrel proof whiskey. This means that the whiskey in this glass has just been straight out of the barrel, filtered probably, I'm not going to go through the etiquette and read it, but filtered or non-filtered, and then put into the glass, put into the bottle, and I'm tasting it. This means that when somebody tasted it from the barrel, they like this taste as it is. Amazing. But it means to me that we haven't really played around with it. We haven't really figured out, okay, what ABV is the perfect blend for this whiskey. And it allows you to also experiment, drop the ABV, open up the aromas, and change and manipulate the whiskey to still get a lot of flavor and to break it apart and kind of experiment on your own, which I think is a quite cool thing when buying barrel proof versus buying something which is 40% alcohol and just on the limits. Now, that being said, that's one reason, but the second reason is, again, the more alcohol you have, the more ABV you have, the more of those flavors you've trapped into that whiskey. And now you are in charge of breaking them open and exploring the full richness of that product versus a watered down version of it. So just to quickly wrap up, quick conclusion, by adding 3 drops of water to your whiskey, you're going to drop the ABV by around 5%, give or take, again, if you're at 62.5 or 60%. Now, the aroma will break open, it's going to change, become a little bit more rich, especially in Scotch whiskeys. This is the Speyside. You're going to get a lot more kind of flowery aromas, maybe a little bit more malt, stuff like that. Also in peat, it's very interesting to try adding a few drops of water to a peated whiskey because that really changes things up. Now, that's the nose. The taste might take a small change, but it's not going to be as impactful and as big and bold as a difference that you get on the nose. Some whiskeys really need a few drops of water to open up and become something quite amazing. That. And if you are getting too much burn in your throat and kind of going down your body from drinking high proof alcohol like this, well, adding water is probably not going to get rid of that unless you're adding a whole lot, which I don't recommend. It's probably how you are drinking it. So check out our video on how to drink high proof alcohol, and yeah, try it. See what 5% difference in alcohol and some drops of water make to the glass, and let me know what you think. But until then, cheers to you and your next glass of whiskey with a few drops of water. Or not in it, it's up to you. I'm gonna enjoy it. Later all.